Good afternoon, everybody. So today we're going to be talking about some of the work that we did for the North of Tyne Combined Authority as part of their data science project with us. This work was done by myself, Ben Yeager, as well as Jordan Childs, David Towers, and Sarah Gascoigne. So to set the scene a little bit, the North of Tyne Combined Authority is a combination of three local authorities for Newcastle, North Tyneside, and Northumberland. And they're a relatively new political body, only about 18 months or so old. And so they came to us seeing if they could get some data insights to help them better make policy. They wanted us to look into areas of economic growth, into employment, into the environment, into COVID-19, see how that affected things. All of this with the aim of getting a better lay of the land in terms of the region that they were governing, since, as they stated to us in their original brief, good policy and investment is underpinned by good intelligence. With that, they laid out some key themes that they had since their founding and that were pretty important to them. One of these was green growth, the idea of looking into how growth in different industry sectors had impacted our environment, both negatively in terms of sectors that are associated with releasing lots of greenhouse gases and carbon, such as manufacturing, that kind of thing, but also sectors that help promote the environment, such as green energy, wind farms, solar turbines, that kind of thing. Another one of these key themes was economic inclusivity. This is looking into indicators of people being left behind economically, people not having access to economic opportunities, having food poverty or in-work poverty, not having the access to skills they need to move ahead. And so with all that scene setting out of the way, I'm going to pass you over to Jordan, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the findings.
So to start off, we're going to look at data provided us by the West End Food Bank. This is a local food bank based here in Newcastle, and it has several different distribution centres dotted about the area. So this data concerns the number of parcels fulfilled across all of its distribution centres. So the parcels fulfilled are when someone comes into the food bank and they get a parcel of food. So this is the total number over the past few years. We immediately see that there's an overall rise in the number of parcels, but we also see there are two large spikes in the data. The first coincides with a change in the benefit system across the UK, which delayed the benefits people were entitled to, so then they had to come in to use the food bank. And the second coincides with the COVID-19 lockdown of March 2020, and then there was another peak in the November lockdown of 2020 as well. So here we see how national policies across the UK really impact people in our local area and impact people's lives as a whole rather than just in the big picture. But now we want to drill down into this data and look at smaller areas and how deprivation impacts people there. So if we move to the next dashboard, on the map, we see lots of different points. Each point corresponds to a mid-level super output area, and the size of that point shows the estimated proportion of the population which are using a food bank, or using the West End Food Bank more specifically. And the colour of the point shows the index of multiple deprivation decile, which that mid-level super output area is in. So we also selected three domains which we think are very relevant to whether or not an area will be more likely or less likely to use a food bank. These are income deprivation affecting children, and income deprivation affecting older people. So we can really drill down into specific deciles here. So if we just select the income deciles 1 and 2, so that's the top 20% of most deprived areas with respect to income, this is what we see on the map. And it also changes the bar chart showing the number of food parcels given out per decile on the left. So this is really helpful where we can see how these three domains are affecting the number of people using the food bank and any correlation within there. But this data doesn't concern any homeless person that's using a food bank, as when they go into food bank, they don't have an address to write down, so we can't relate that to an MSOA. So now we just want to look at the homeless population who are using the food bank. So this is just the total number of parcels given out to homeless people within the past year or so, starting at February 2020 and ending at March 2021. So this is really recent, really relevant to what's happening now. And the 3 X's on the graph show the national lockdowns implemented due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But we can look into this further by selecting the age group that the person was in. So if we start off by looking at 20 to 30, we see an overall decline in the number of parcels given out to this age group. So that's a positive thing. The homeless people will be decreasing in the area. But if we look at 40 to 50, we see a very sharp rise, especially even since the November lockdown. There's been a massive increase in the number of homeless people in the area using a food bank. We're not sure why this is. This is definitely something to look into further, and somewhere where the NTCA can really help. And lastly, we just see the number of distribution centres, the distribution centres and number of parcels they give out to homeless people in particular. So we see that the Church of the Venerable Bede gives out the highest number of food parcels to homeless people, but it's worth noting that some distribution centres were new, some were temporary, so this is not an excellent representation, but we see like which distribution centres are the most well established within the homeless community and which ones are used the most. So now I'm going to pass you over to Sarah, who's going to look into the food bank data a bit more and drill down further into that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jordan. So the first thing I'm going to have a little look at is the distribution centres, more specifically how far people have travelled to reach each of those distribution centres. So as an example, if we look at the year 2020 and the Lilia Centre, which is located on Benwell Road in Newcastle, we can see that the majority of users are coming from the centre of Newcastle upon Tyne. Now this is to be expected as this is where the food bank is located. But interestingly, we do see some people have travelled from a little further afar, most notably from Blyth. Now I'm unsure at this point if this is because that individual has chosen to travel to this centre or if there's a lack of information available for more local food banks in their area. This could be something that's further looked into. Another thing to consider with distribution centres is the number of people visiting. So as you can see here, from January 2018 to March 2021, the most frequently visited centre is the Church of the Venerable Bede. Now, it should be noted that not all of these centres were established by the start of data collection. So in the year 2018, there was only the Church of the Venerable Bede and the Lilia Centre, with the Church of the Venerable Bede being the most popular. Now, skipping forward to 2020, we can see that more people are at the Lilia Centre, and there are a lot of people who've moved out to other centres, which is likely due to geographical reasons, that these centres are closer to individuals, and so it's just a little bit more convenient for them to travel there. So the next thing I'm going to discuss is crises. Now, crises is a term used by the food bank. Now, this is what's reported by the users as the main reason. So the primary crisis is the main reason for them using the food bank. And then they can report as many secondary crises, so how many things are adding to their need. Now, this is because it's not as simple as there's one reason for someone needing a food bank. There's often a lot of factors involved, but the primary is what they consider to be the main reason. So looking at this, the most prevalent primary crisis is low income, followed by benefit changes. Now, if we have a look at low income in particular, an aggregated sum of the primary and secondary crises, this shows that the highest secondary crisis with this is debt. Now, we've assumed that this is because with a low income, individuals will seek out loans to help pay for things, especially such as a boiler breaking, so emergency things that they need to pay for but don't have the funds for. They'll take out a loan, but then it's difficult to pay a loan back whilst funding a lifestyle whilst on a low income. Now, the final thing that I'm going to discuss is the changes in food bank usage with respect to COVID-19. Now, this pandemic It's completely unprecedented times. These are things that no one has experienced in their lifetimes, and the West End Food Bank hasn't seen this before. Now, if we look at this as a comparison from use in 2019 to 2020, we can use the plot on the left. Now, this shows the percentage change from 2019 to 20. Now, it should be noted that this is ordered from the highest percentage change to the lowest, as opposed to chronologically. So we can see at the start of the year, in January and February, there was actually a decrease of around about a fifth. So fewer people were using the food banks, which means, this was positive. More people were able to access food without having to rely on this service. But this positive trend came to an end in March when COVID-19 came to the UK and the first national lockdown was put in place. So we can see from 19 to 20, April had the largest percentage increase. Now, this was the first full month of national lockdown, so it's not a surprise that a majority of people were, majority change was in this time. Now, one thing that we did consider is how the lockdown would affect families, households with and without children. So if you have a look at households with no children in particular, we can see there's a slight increase around the March and November lockdowns. But families with children, these spikes are far more significant. So basically, what we can ascertain from this is that there's a link between access to free school meals, which is 5 meals per child per week supplied through school, and the school being closed, therefore the family requiring a food bank to access food. So basically, everything we've discussed based on the food bank, we're hoping that this can be used by the food bank to help better understand those who are using their service, and the NTCA to help design projects and initiatives to help individuals who are having to require this service. For example, maybe helping access, so helping people find food banks that are a little bit closer to them to reduce the need to travel, and maybe targeting crises to support those who, for example, are experiencing low income, to help them to get themselves out of a place where they do require extra assistance for food. Now, I'm going to pass you on to David, who's going to look at the second branch of our report, which is to do with green growth and carbon emissions.
Thank you, Sarah. Now, as Ben mentioned earlier, the NTCA has 2 key themes: economic inclusivity, which Sarah and John have just talked about, and green growth. To investigate green growth, we looked at the greenhouse gases data and compared it against company growth. Company growth can be tracked in a few ways, one of which is GVA, or gross value added, which is the amount of money they bring in. Another way is the number of employees they have. And a further way is leverage, but we don't look into leverage because there's not a data set for it. So this dashboard page focuses on GVA. So on both graphs, the dark blue line is the emission, which is tracked in 1,000 tons of CO2 equivalent. Currently, the selected emission is CO2, and the light blue line is GVA. So the top graph is in the northeast. We would have liked to go for the north of Tyne, but since it's a new authority, a lot of the data sets only go down to the northeast level, and the greenhouse gases data is already at an estimate, and there's no good data source for me to use to make a more accurate estimate. Currently, the estimate for the northeast greenhouse gases data is using a proportion of the companies that are in the northeast. So these graphs can be used to try and find trends and also compare the northeast to the national level. What we can see is in both graphs that between 2008 and 2009, there's a sharp decrease in emissions and GVA, which would suggest that the two are linked, at least for those years. And this also seems to be a sharp, but not as sharp, increase between 2009 and 2010. So more investigation would need to be done to see what the reason for that was, but those types of directions are what these graphs are meant for. We can also focus in on a sector. So the Standardized Industrial Classification 2007 codes break down all of industry into multiple sectors, including agriculture, forestry, and fishing. So we can look at that. And we can go even further, looking at the divisions. So breaking up the sector even further. And we can also look at different emissions. For example, instead of CO2, we can look at methane. One of the more useful ones is total, which allows you to see a more level playing field, because construction isn't going to use as much methane, but it's going to use CO2, while agriculture is going to use more methane than CO2. So the employees page does the same thing, but instead of comparing against the GVA, it compares against the number of employees. It doesn't seem to be as noticeable as a trend as there was in the GVA data. However, what's important to notice is that there's less data available for number of employees, since it only goes back to 2015. What is also important to note is that our source for the employees by industrial sector did not include Northern Ireland. So although the greenhouse gases data is for the UK, the employees are only for Great Britain, which does skew the data a bit. However, we felt it was still going to be a good indicator at the very least. Similarly, we can select the different emission or the total, and we can narrow in on an industrial sector. So the next page is proportions. Now this allows us to see rates of change. So for example, on the top graph, which is the greenhouse gas by GVA, you can see that there's a noticeable trend downwards, which is good. So this is the emission over the GVA. Light blue line is the UK, and the dark blue line is the Northeast. So we can, as I said, we can see that there's a downward trend. This might be due to a decrease in greenhouse gases, or it might be an increase in GVA. Hopefully it would be a bit of both, as that would suggest that companies are growing while emissions are going down. And the bottom graph is by employees, and there does seem to be a slight change in the UK, but it's at 3 decimal places, so it's hard to tell. Employees don't seem to have as much an effect, but we were asked to track them as they are one of the methods of measuring company growth. And again, we can look at different emissions, so we can look at methane or total, and we can narrow in on a sector, for example, agriculture, and go to agriculture and hunting. There seems to be a spike in 2001. More investigation would be required to explain why, but again, these are the type of insights that this dashboard is here to help identify and find areas to look into. So the final page is the comparison page. So this page allows you to compare the top 9 SIC 07 divisions by amount of emissions they produce, their GVA, and the number of employees they have. So this is useful because we can see that 35 is by far the most emission producing, with 41% roughly of emissions in the Northeast being produced from that sector. But that's for just with CO2. And if we go to total, I mean, it's still 35, but it does change to only 31.8%. This page is very useful because it allows us to compare specifics. So we can compare, by holding on control, we can compare agriculture and hunting to civil engineering, and 35, which was electricity, gas, and steam. And we've seen out of these 3, 35 produces the most greenhouse gases. However, it still produces the most GVA, however, it's not as big of a jump, so that might be an indicator to ask them to reduce the amount of emissions they permit if you can give them some financial aid in response, which is one of the things the NTCA suggested they could have a look into. 42 seems to have very low GHG, but it's very good in GVA, well, in the middle of our 3, which might suggest to the NTCA to fund the growth of that sector. Well, that was our presentation. Thank you all for listening. We'd like to especially thank the West End Food Bank for providing us with the data. We'd also like to thank the National Innovation Centre for Data for helping us in the early weeks of the project. We'd also like to thank Jen, Paul, and Colin for helping us throughout the weeks. And we'd like to give a big thanks to the North Tyne Combined Authority, who were incredibly helpful and incredibly kind throughout the project's duration. If we have any questions, we will answer them now.